She walked 4 miles through a blizzard with a newborn in her arms to marry a man she had never met. She told him she needed a father for her baby. What she did not tell him was that the man who killed her husband was already circling his ranch waiting to take everything. And she was the only one who knew. This is the story of how a mail-order bride, a grieving rancher, and a 3-month-old baby fought to survive a winter that threatened to destroy them all. It began on a frozen afternoon in December 1878 when a stagecoach stopped in front of the Elkhorn post office. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the Elkhorn post office, its iron wheels groaning against frozen earth. A bitter wind swept through the valley like a living thing, tearing at the canvas cover and rattling the wooden frame until the whole rig shuddered. December in Montana Territory had no patience for travelers. It offered cold and silence and the kind of emptiness that could swallow a person whole. Clara Whitfield stepped down from the coach with one arm wrapped around the baby and the other gripping a leather valise so worn the stitching had come loose along the seam. She was 26 years old. She weighed 112 pounds. She had been traveling for 3 weeks from a town in southern Illinois where everything she once knew had been buried in a churchyard alongside a man named Thomas. Henry stirred against her chest, his small body bundled in 2 blankets and a shawl that had once been pale blue, but was now the color of road dust. He was 3 months old. He had been born 3 weeks early in a boarding house bedroom, while a stranger held Clara's hand because there was no one else. The doctor in Illinois had said the boy was fragile. He had said winter could take him if Clara did not find warmth, shelter, and steady food. He had said it the way doctors say things they do not want to repeat, with his eyes fixed on the wall instead of on her face. That was the night Clara had made her decision. Not out of hope, out of arithmetic. A woman alone with a newborn, no family, no income, no land, had a life expectancy measured in weeks. A mail-order bride, even one walking into a stranger's home, had a chance. The advertisement had appeared in the Springfield Register on a Tuesday. She had read it 4 times before cutting it out with her sewing scissors. Rancher 34 seeks woman of good character for marriage. Must be willing to work. No sentiment required. Reply to S. Thornton, Elkhorn, Montana Territory. No sentiment required. Clara had turned those words over in her mind for days. A man who wrote that was either very practical or very wounded. She suspected both. She had written back the same afternoon. She had described herself honestly. Her age, her skills, her willingness to labor. She had mentioned her late husband. She had mentioned that she was alone in the world. She had not mentioned Henry. That omission sat in her chest now like a stone as the stagecoach driver untied her valise and dropped it in the dirt. He pointed north toward the line of hills, half lost in haze. Thornton Ridge is 4 miles that direction. Roads iced over past the creek. Can't take the coach up there. You'll have to walk. Clara looked at the hills. 4 miles, with a baby, in wind that burned the skin off your cheekbones. Thank you, she said. The driver glanced at Henry, then at her, then at the empty road stretching north into nothing. He opened his mouth as if to offer something, a warning perhaps, or an apology for the limitations of his route. Then he closed it, climbed back onto his seat, and drove away. Clara stood alone on the frozen street of Elkhorn, Montana. Population perhaps 300. A scattering of timber buildings, a general store, a saloon, a church with a crooked steeple. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray threads that the wind tore apart as fast as they formed. No one was outside. The cold had driven the whole town behind closed doors. Henry began to cry. Clara adjusted him, pressing his face gently against the warmth of her neck. "We'll be all right, my love," she whispered. "Mama found us a home." Her voice cracked once, just once, on the word home. Then it steadied. She had learned months ago that tears solved nothing. Grief was a luxury. Fear was a luxury. The only currency that mattered now was action. But before the 4-mile walk, she needed milk. Her own supply had thinned over 3 weeks of poor food and sleepless nights on train benches and stagecoach floors. Henry needed supplemental feeding, and she had run out of the tinned milk she had carried from Illinois 2 days ago. She pushed open the door of the general store. A bell chimed. Warmth hit her face like a soft hand, and for a moment she nearly swayed with the relief of it. The store smelled of molasses, tobacco, and wood smoke. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with canned goods, fabric bolts, tools, and the 100 small necessities of frontier life. 3 women stood near the fabric section, their conversation dropping to a murmur as Clara entered. Behind the counter stood a woman of about 55, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, with steel gray hair, pulled back in a bun tight enough to stretch the skin at her temples. Her name, though Clara did not yet know it was Edna Pickett. She owned this store with her husband. She ran the women's auxiliary at the church. She considered herself the moral compass of Elkhorn, and she wielded that compass like a weapon. Clara approached the counter. Henry squirmed beneath his blankets, and a small fist emerged, waving blindly at the warm air. "Good afternoon," Clara said. "I need tinned milk if you have it, and a small bag of oats." Edna looked at her, then at the baby, then back at her. "You're not from here." "No, ma'am, I've just arrived. I'm Clara Whitfield. I've come to be married to Mr. Silas Thornton." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Clara felt it press against her chest. The three women by the fabric section turned fully now, their eyes moving between Clara and Edna with the particular alertness of people who sense gossip forming in real time. Edna's lips thinned. "Silas Thornton," she repeated, "Eleanor's husband." "I understand Mr. Thornton is a widower, yes." Edna placed both hands flat on the counter. "Eleanor Thornton hasn't been cold in the ground 2 years, and he's already sent for a replacement." Her voice carried across the store with the precision of a woman accustomed to being heard. "And this one comes with someone else's child already in her arms." Lord have mercy. The words landed like slaps. Clara felt heat rise to her face, not from embarrassment, but from the effort of holding herself still. She had known this would come. She had prepared for it on every mile of the journey. The judgment, the whispers, the assumption that a woman arriving with a baby and no husband was either a liar or worse. One of the women by the fabric called out, "That baby yours?" Clara turned to face her. "He's mine. His father is dead." Edna made a sound, half laugh, half snort. "How convenient." The store went very quiet. Henry let out a thin cry, as if sensing the tension in his mother's rigid body. Clara looked down at him, then back at Edna. She did not drop her gaze. She did not explain further. She did not defend herself. She simply reached into her coat pocket, placed coins on the counter, and said, "The milk and the oats, please." Edna stared at the coins. For a long moment, Clara thought the woman might refuse to serve her. Then Edna reached below the counter, produced a tin of milk and a small cloth sack of oats, and pushed them across without a word. Her expression said everything her mouth did not. Clara Whitfield had been measured, categorized, and condemned in the space of 30 seconds. She was a scandal. She was an outsider. She was a woman who had no business carrying another man's child into Eleanor Thornton's home. Clara picked up the items, placed them in her valise, and walked out of the store with her back straight and her head level. The bell chimed behind her, the cold hit her face, and she welcomed it because cold was honest. Cold did not pretend. Outside, a horse was tied to the hitching post. A tall man stood beside it, adjusting a saddle strap with hands that were large, scarred, and unhurried. He wore a heavy coat, dark hat, and boots caked with frozen mud. His jaw was square and hard, his eyes the color of storm clouds, and his posture carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to controlling large animals and difficult land. He was 34 years old. He looked older. Grief had that effect. Silas Thornton had been inside the store when Clara entered. He had stepped out through the back door the moment he heard Edna's voice rise, not because he was avoiding the confrontation, but because he had heard every word through the open window and needed a moment to process what he had just learned. The advertisement said nothing about a child. Her letter said nothing about a child. And now she stood on his doorstep, so to speak, with an infant in her arms and a lie behind her. Clara stopped when she saw him. She knew who he was before he spoke. There was only one man in Elkhorn who would be standing beside that particular horse, looking at her with that particular expression, equal parts assessment and wariness. Their eyes met. He saw copper hair tangled by wind, red-rimmed eyes that held no tears, a straight back despite the weight of exhaustion, and a baby clutched against her chest with a fierceness that told him everything about her priorities. She saw gray eyes that measured her without cruelty, weathered hands that had built things and buried things, and a stillness about him that was not coldness, but control, the kind of control a man develops when everything inside him is in chaos, and he cannot afford to let it show. "You, Clara Whitfield." His voice was low, roughened by cold air and sparse use. Yes. Your letters didn't mention a child. The wind gusted between them, pulling at her skirts and snapping the brim of his hat. Henry made a small sound, a whimper swallowed by the gale. No, Clara said. She did not flinch. She did not look away. They didn't. I lied. Because if I told you, you would have refused before I had the chance to stand in front of you and prove I'm worth the trouble. Silas studied her. 5 seconds. 10. Long enough for Clara to feel the weight of every mile she had traveled, every decision she had made, every desperate calculation that had led her to this frozen street in front of a man who owed her nothing. Then he unbuttoned his outer coat, a heavy wool duster lined with sheepskin, and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth was immediate startling, and it carried the smell of wood smoke and leather and horse sweat. He did not say, "You must be freezing." He did not say, "I forgive you for lying." He just took the coat off his own back and put it on hers, and then he nodded toward the horse. "Climb up. The boy will freeze before we're done talking." He helped her into the saddle, handed up the valise, then swung up behind her. His arms reached around her to hold the reins, and for a moment Clara was enclosed in something she had not felt in months. Safety, not love, not trust, just the physical reality of another human body between her and the wind. They rode north in silence. 4 miles of frozen road, the horses' hooves crunching through ice, the valley stretching around them in shades of white and gray, in the dark green of distant pines. Clara held Henry against her chest beneath the borrowed coat and felt his small heartbeat against her own. She did not know if Silas Thornton would keep her. She did not know if tomorrow she would be back on that road walking south with nothing. But for now, the horse moved forward, and the wind was at their backs, and the man behind her had given her his coat without being asked. Thornton Ridge appeared through the haze like something carved from the land itself. Clara had expected a cabin. What she saw was a ranch, a 2-story timber house with a stone chimney trailing smoke. A barn large and solidly built with double doors closed against the wind. Corrals, fences, a chicken coop, a smokehouse. Beyond the buildings, cattle moved in distant pastures, dark shapes against white ground. This was not the homestead of a man barely surviving. This was the work of years of sweat of a family that had planted itself deep in Montana soil. Clara understood then why Silas Thornton had written "No sentiment required." He did not need a wife for love. He needed a wife because a ranch this size demanded 2 pairs of hands, and the house he had built for a family was empty. Silas helped her down and led her inside. The interior confirmed what the exterior promised. Solid furniture, a large stone hearth, a kitchen with iron pots and a cast iron stove, shelves lined with tools and provisions. Everything was clean, everything was ordered, and everything was empty. No curtains on the windows, no flowers, no color, no softness. The house had the feeling of a place maintained by habit rather than desire, a man going through the motions of living without any of the warmth that made living worthwhile. Clara's eyes moved across the room and stopped. In the corner near the hearth sat a cradle. It was made of dark walnut hand carved with delicate scrollwork along the rails and small stars cut into the headboard. It was beautiful. It was covered in a thin layer of dust, and it was empty. She understood at once. Silas had built that cradle for a child who never came, a child who died with Eleanor on a frozen road somewhere between this house and the nearest doctor. The cradle was not furniture. It was a monument. It was the shape of everything Silas Thornton had lost. Clara said nothing about it. She set her valise down, adjusted Henry in her arms, and turned to face Silas, who had added a log to the fire and was standing with his back to her, staring into the flames. "I'll say it plainly," Clara said. "I need a father for my baby, and you need a wife. I don't ask for love. I don't ask for charity. I offer my labor, my loyalty, and my word. I will cook clean, tend your house, mend your clothes, and work alongside you through whatever this winter brings. I ask only that you give my son a roof, a fire, and the protection of your name." Silas did not turn around. "Why me? There are other advertisements. Other men. Because you wrote 3 sentences and told the truth in every one of them. You said you wanted a woman of good character. You said she must be willing to work. And you said no sentiment required. A man who says that is a man I can trust because he has no interest in pretending." Now he turned. His gray eyes found hers across the room, and in the firelight they were not cold. They were searching, testing. looking for something he could not name. "You know about me," he said. It was not a question. "I know you lost your wife. I know you live alone. I know you built a cradle for a child who was never born." She glanced at the corner, then back at him. "A man who writes no sentiment required is a man who has had too much of it and lost." The words struck him. Clara saw it in the way his shoulders tightened, in the brief flicker of something raw and unguarded that crossed his face before the mask slid back into place. He looked at her for a long moment. "You're bold," he said, "and you're a liar. You hid the child from me." "I'm a mother," Clara said. "The two are not always separate." Silence settled between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Henry's soft breathing. Silas looked at the baby. Henry's eyes were open wide and dark, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling with the blank wonder of a creature for whom everything is new. His tiny fingers flexed against the edge of his blanket. Silas looked at those fingers. Then he looked at the empty cradle in the corner. Then he looked at Clara. "There's a room in the back," he said. "It's small. It has a bed and a washstand. You can stay there tonight. I'll decide in the morning." Clara inclined her head. "Thank you." She carried Henry to the back room and closed the door. The room was tiny, barely 8 feet square, with a narrow bed, a wooden washstand, and a window that looked out on the barn. The walls were bare pine and the air smelled of sawdust and disuse. This room had been built recently, Clara realized. The wood was newer than the rest of the house. Silas had added it when Eleanor was pregnant. This was meant to be the nursery. Clara sat on the bed, unwrapped Henry, fed him from the tinned milk she had bought, and changed his cloth. Then she lay down with him beside her, pulling the thin quilt over them both. The wind howled outside. The house creaked and groaned. Through the closed door, she could hear Silas's footsteps, slow and heavy, pacing back and forth across the main room. She pressed her lips to Henry's forehead. "He'll keep us," she whispered, though she did not know if it was a prayer or a lie. "He has to. There's nowhere else to go." Silas did not sleep that night. He sat beside the fire with a cup of coffee that went cold in his hands and stared at the flames while the wind screamed against the walls of the house he had built for a life that no longer existed. Eleanor came to him in fragments, the sound of her laugh bright and sudden like a bird startled from a bush. The way she would stand in the doorway on summer evenings, one hand on her belly, watching the sun go down behind the western ridge. The morning she told him she was carrying his child, and the way the world had gone soft and golden around the edges, as if God himself had decided to be generous for once. And then the night. The blizzard that came without warning. The cattle scattered across the north pasture. Silas riding out because the herd was his livelihood and he could not afford to lose them. Eleanor saying she would be fine. She had said it with that particular calm of hers, the calm that made everything seem manageable. And he had believed her because he wanted to believe her, because believing her meant he could do his duty and come home to find her waiting. He had come home to an empty house, the horse and buggy gone, tracks leading south toward town already half buried in snow. He had followed them for 6 miles through the worst storm he could remember, calling her name into a wind that swallowed every sound until he found the buggy overturned at the bend near Copper Creek, and Eleanor beside it, on the ground, in the snow. Her coat spread beneath her as if she had tried to make a bed, her hands folded across her belly, her face so white she could have been carved from the ice itself. The doctor said she had gone into labor. The cold and the fall had done the rest. The baby, a girl, had never drawn a breath. Silas had built 2 coffins that week. One large, one impossibly small. He had dug the graves himself in frozen ground that fought him for every inch. And when it was done, he had gone back to the house and sat in the chair where he was sitting now, and had not moved for 3 days. That was 2 years ago. He had not spoken Eleanor's name aloud since the funeral. He had not touched the cradle. He had not entered the nursery room until tonight, when he had offered it to a stranger and her child. A thin cry pierced the silence. "Henry." The baby was crying, and then Clara's voice followed, low and trembling, singing something Silas did not recognize. A lullaby, perhaps, or just sounds meant to soothe. The singing was unsteady, the voice of a woman too tired to hold a tune, but too stubborn to stop trying. Silas rose from his chair and walked to the nursery door. He did not open it. He stood there, one hand flat against the rough pine, and listened. The crying faded. The singing continued, softer now, barely a whisper. For the first time in 2 years, there was a child's voice in this house, and a woman's, and the sound of life where there had been only silence. He returned to his chair. He sat until dawn, and somewhere in those hours between the dying of the fire and the first gray light through the window, he made his decision. When Clara emerged in the morning, Henry against her shoulder, she found the stove already lit, water heating, and a bowl of oatmeal on the table. Silas stood by the window, his back to her, silhouetted against the pale winter light. "The ceremony will be this afternoon," he said without turning. "Reverend Crane comes at 2. There are conditions." Clara's heart lurched, but her voice held steady. "Name them." "Separate rooms. This is a marriage on paper." "Agreed. You handle the house. I handle the ranch. We don't interfere with each other's work." "Agreed. If spring comes and either of us wants to end it, we divorce clean. No claims, no disputes." "Agreed." Clara paused. "I have one condition of my own." Silas turned now, his expression wary. "Henry carries your name," Clara said. "Whatever happens between us, whatever you decide come spring, he will not grow up without a father's name in this valley. He will be Henry Thornton." The request hung in the air. Clara watched Silas process it. Giving the child his name meant legal responsibility. It meant binding himself to this boy in a way that went beyond paper and convenience. It meant that if things fell apart, he would still be connected to this child, this stranger's child, for the rest of his life. Silas looked at Henry. The baby was awake, his dark eyes unfocused but open, his small mouth working silently. One tiny hand emerged from the blanket and reached toward nothing in particular, fingers spread wide, grasping at the light. Silas looked at the empty corner where the cradle had stood for 2 years, gathering dust, holding nothing but memory and grief. "Agreed," he said. Reverend Samuel Crane arrived at 2 o'clock sharp, a thin man with kind eyes and a Bible that had been rebound twice. Ruth Calloway came as witness, a woman of 62, with iron gray hair and a face that had been softened by loss and hardened by survival in equal measure. She had been Eleanor's nearest neighbor and closest friend. She looked at Clara the way a mother looks at the woman her son has brought home. Not with hostility exactly, but with a wariness that made clear she was reserving judgment. The ceremony lasted 4 minutes. Reverend Crane spoke the words. Clara spoke hers. Silas spoke his. Henry slept through the entire thing, which Ruth later said was either a blessing or an omen, depending on how you looked at it. When it was done, Clara Whitfield became Clara Thornton. The name felt strange on her tongue, like a coat that did not yet fit. But it was a name and it was shelter, and for now, that was enough. By evening, the news had reached every household in Elkhorn. Silas Thornton, the widower of Eleanor Thornton, had married a mail-order bride from Illinois who had arrived with another man's baby. The story passed from kitchen to kitchen, porch to porch saloon, to church gathering embellishment at every stop. Clara had trapped him. Clara was running from scandal. The baby was not even her dead husband's. Silas had lost his mind with grief. Edna Pickett was the engine of the gossip, though she would have called it concern. She told every woman who came into her store that Silas was being taken advantage of, that Eleanor was barely cold, that someone ought to say something. She did not say it to Silas himself. She did not need to. She had planted the seeds, and the town would do the rest. At the saloon that same evening, a different kind of attention fell on the news. Denton Graves sat at his usual table in the back corner, a glass of whiskey untouched before him, listening to the talk with the expression of a man watching cards being dealt into his hand. Graves was 45, broad through the chest, with a face that smiled easily and eyes that never did. He had been a captain in the Union Army during the war, and he carried the habits of command into civilian life the way some men carry scars. He owned Graves Crossing, the ranch that bordered Thornton Ridge to the south, and for 3 years he had wanted one thing: Clearwater Creek, the only reliable water source in the valley, and it ran through Silas Thornton's land. Graves turned to the man beside him. Virgil Poole, 30 years old, lean as a fence post, with a face that revealed nothing and hands that were never far from the revolver on his hip. Virgil was Graves's primary enforcer, though neither man used that word. "A married man has weaknesses, a solitary man does not," Graves said quietly. "Find out everything about that woman, where she came from, what she's hiding." He paused and took a sip of whiskey. "Everyone hides something, Virgil. Everyone." The first days of Clara's life at Thornton Ridge were governed by labor and silence. She rose before dawn, fed Henry, lit the stove, and began the work of transforming a house maintained by habit into a home sustained by care. She patched the drafts beneath doors with rags and old newspapers. She scrubbed the kitchen until the iron pots gleamed. She discovered a flour sack with enough fabric to sew crude curtains, and she hung them on the windows so the harsh winter light was softened into something gentler. She did not wait for instructions. She observed what was needed and did it. When Silas came in from the cold at midday, he found a hot meal on the table and his torn work shirt mended and folded on the back of a chair. He ate without comment. He looked at the curtains on the windows. He said nothing. But the next morning, Clara found a stack of dry firewood placed beside the kitchen door, cut to the exact size the stove required. She had not asked for it. Silas had not mentioned it. He had simply noticed that she was burning green wood that smoked and spat, and he had solved the problem without a word. This was how they communicated in those early days. Not through conversation, but through action. A patched shirt answered by dry firewood. A clean floor answered by a repaired hinge on the bedroom door. A warm meal answered by an extra blanket left on her bed, folded with the kind of care that suggested it had been taken from his own. Hank Jessup, Silas's longest-serving ranch hand, was less subtle in his opinions. A man of 28 with sunburned skin and a permanent squint, Hank had worked Thornton Ridge for 5 years and considered himself something of an authority on how things should be run. He took one look at Clara and decided she was a liability. On her third morning, Clara went out to collect eggs and found the chicken coop gate standing wide open. Every hen had scattered into the yard, and beyond a dozen birds wandering through snow, they had no business being in, clucking in confused circles. Clara looked at the gate, which she knew she had latched the night before. She looked toward the barn, where Hank was leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed and a smirk barely hidden beneath his hat brim. Clara said nothing. She set Henry down in a safe spot near the house wall, wrapped him tight, and spent the next 2 hours chasing chickens through ankle-deep snow. She caught every single one. Her dress was soaked, her hands were raw, her hair had come loose from its pins and hung in frozen strands across her face. But every bird was back in the coop when Silas rode in that afternoon. Silas looked at the coop. He looked at Clara, who was wringing out her dress hem by the back door. He looked at Hank, who was suddenly very interested in something happening inside the barn. Silas did not say a word, but that evening he replaced the coop gate with new hinges and a latch that required deliberate effort to open. The sabotage would not work twice. Ruth Calloway came to visit on the 5th day. She brought a jar of preserved cherries and a silence that lasted the length of 2 cups of tea before she said what she had come to say. Eleanor would have been 28 this month. Clara set down her cup. I know, she said quietly. Silas has not spoken her name to me, but I see her everywhere in this house, in the things he built, in the things he cannot bring himself to change. Ruth studied her. You're not trying to replace her. No, ma'am, I'm not trying to replace anyone. I'm trying to survive, and perhaps in time to make this house feel like a home again. Not for my sake, for his, and for Henry's. Ruth was silent for a moment. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a folded cloth. She set it on the table between them. It was a handkerchief, white linen, with delicate flowers embroidered along the border in blue thread. The stitching was expert, beautiful. Eleanor made this, Ruth said. I brought it to see what you would do with it. Clara picked it up. She turned it over in her hands, examining the needlework with the trained eye of a seamstress's daughter. Then she folded it carefully, precisely along its original creases, and placed it back on the table exactly where Ruth had set it. This is beautiful work, Clara said. Eleanor had talented hands. Ruth's expression changed. The wariness softened. The testing was over. Clara had passed, not by competing with Eleanor's memory, but by honoring it. The nights were long. Clara lay awake with Henry beside her, listening to the house settle and creak to the wind outside and to the occasional sound of Silas's footsteps in the main room. He did not sleep well. She could hear him moving through the dark, feeding the fire, sitting pacing again. One night, perhaps the 8th or 9th, Clara woke to Henry's cry and carried him out to warm milk by the stove. The main room was dark except for the orange glow of embers. She stopped in the doorway. Silas was sitting on the floor in the corner where the cradle had stood. His hand rested on the bare floorboards, fingers spread across the space where the cradle's runners had left faint marks in the wood. He was not crying, he was not speaking. He was simply there in the dark, touching the empty space where his child's bed had been, as if he could feel some trace of what it once held. Clara stepped back into the nursery without making a sound. She sat on the bed and held Henry and did not go back out. She understood now. Silas had given the cradle away. He had carried it into her room for Henry without a word, but that did not mean the space it left was painless. The cradle was no longer a monument to loss. It held a living child now, and the empty corner was the price Silas paid for that generosity. 2 mornings later, Clara found the cradle in her room had been cleaned, the dust wiped away, and a new sheepskin lining placed inside it. Henry fit perfectly. She laid him down and watched his small body settle into the warmth, his fingers curling around the edge of the wool, his face relaxing into sleep. Clara touched the carved stars on the headboard. Silas had made these stars for a child who never came. Now they watched over a child who had arrived from 1,000 miles away, carried by a woman Silas had never met, born to a man Silas would never know. Clara turned away from the cradle so that if Silas happened to walk past the open door, he would not see the tears on her face. The days settled into rhythm. Clara cooked, cleaned, mended, and managed the house with an efficiency that Silas noticed without acknowledging. Silas rode out at dawn, tended cattle, repaired fences, and returned at dusk with dirt on his hands and silence on his tongue. They ate together. They exchanged practical information. The north fence needs mending. I patched the draft in the kitchen. The baby slept through the night. Then they retreated to their separate rooms, and the house held its breath until morning. But small things accumulated. Silas began carving again. The first piece was a tiny wooden horse, no larger than his thumb, smooth and carefully shaped. He left it on the kitchen table one morning without explanation. When Clara asked what it was for, he said, "The boy needs something to hold." Clara picked it up. The detail was remarkable. Every curve, every line spoke of hours of patient work. This was not a careless gesture. This was a man who had stayed up after she went to sleep, whittling by firelight, making something beautiful for a child he had only just begun to know. She placed the horse on the shelf beside Henry's cradle. That evening, she saw Silas glance at the shelf as he passed the open door, checking to see if the horse was still there. It was, and the look on his face, brief, unguarded, almost relieved, told Clara more than any conversation could have. One afternoon, while washing clothes beside Clearwater Creek, the stream that ran along the eastern boundary of Thornton Ridge, Clara looked up and saw 2 riders on the far hill. They sat motionless on their horses, watching her. They wore dark coats and hats pulled low. Neither spoke. Neither moved. They simply watched the way predators watch from a distance before deciding whether to approach. Henry was in a basket beside her, bundled against the cold. Clara picked him up slowly, keeping her movements calm, and walked back toward the house. She did not run. Running would show fear, and fear was an invitation. But she walked quickly, and she did not look back. When she told Silas, his face went dark. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He went to the window and stared out at the distant hills for a long time. "Stay inside," he said. "Both of you. Don't go nearer the creek alone again." Who were they? Silas did not answer. And Clara understood that his silence was more dangerous than any answer he could have given. 3 days later, the danger took a name and a face. Clara was on the porch beating dust from a rug, Henry asleep inside, when a single rider came up the road. He rode slowly, confidently on a black horse with silver fittings. He wore a long coat and a hat of fine quality, and his posture in the saddle spoke of military training. He smiled as he approached, and the smile did not reach his eyes. Silas came around the corner of the barn. His hand was near his hip, not on his gun, but near it. His body moved between Clara and the rider with a precision that was not accidental. "Afternoon, Thornton," the man said, reining his horse to a stop at the gate. "I'm Denton Graves, your neighbor to the south. I came to welcome your new bride." Silas said nothing. His expression was stone. Graves looked past him to Clara. His gaze was appraising, thorough and unhurried, the way a man looks at property he intends to acquire. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, tipping his hat, "I hope you're settling in well. It's a hard land for a woman alone. Harder still with a little one." Clara held his gaze. "I'm not alone, Mr. Graves." Graves smiled again. No, I suppose you're not. Not anymore." He turned back to Silas. "I won't take much of your time. Just a friendly reminder. The water rights hearing is in 6 weeks. Judge Beckett will want to see your survey documents. I do hope you haven't misplaced them. The wind gusted. Silas's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Graves tilted his head as if a thought had just occurred to him, though Clara could see it had been prepared. Fine-looking boy, your wife's child, he said. He reminds me of someone. A miner, I think. In Illinois. Clara's blood went cold. The words hit her like a fist to the stomach. Illinois. A miner. Thomas. Graves knew about Thomas. Silas saw Clara's reaction. He saw the color drain from her face, saw her hands tighten on the porch rail, saw the flash of something that was not surprise but terror. He did not understand it, but he recognized fear when he saw it, and the fact that this man had caused it was enough. Get off my property, Silas said. His voice was quiet. That was what made it dangerous. Graves held up both hands in mock surrender. Just being neighborly, Thornton. No need for hostility. He tipped his hat, once more turned his horse, and rode back down the road at the same unhurried pace. In the moment before Graves disappeared over the hill, Clara saw something in his posture. A satisfaction. The satisfaction of a man who has played a card and watched it land exactly where he intended. Silas turned to Clara. What did he mean about the miner in Illinois? Clara looked at him. Her mouth opened. The truth sat on her tongue like a hot coal. Thomas. The mine. The accident that was not an accident. The connection between her dead husband and the man who had just ridden away smiling. I don't know, she said. It was a lie. Her third lie to Silas Thornton. The first had been about Henry. The second had been the omission in her letters. This one was different. This one was born not of desperation but of fear. Because Clara Whitfield Thornton, standing on the porch of her new home, holding the railing to keep her hands from shaking, had just realized something that changed everything. The man who wanted to take this ranch might be the same man who had killed her husband. And she was not ready to say that aloud. Not yet. Not until she was sure. Because if she was right, then the danger was not just about water rights and land deeds. It was about murder. And the man who had committed it was their neighbor, smiling, patient, and already circling. The wind picked up. Snow began to fall light at first, then thicker, until the distant hills vanished behind a curtain of white. Clara watched the road where Graves had disappeared and felt the cold settle into her bones deeper than any winter could reach. Inside, Henry began to cry. Clara turned from the road, crossed the porch, and went to her son. She picked him up, held him close, and whispered into his soft hair, I'll keep you safe. I'll keep us all safe. She did not know yet how much that promise would cost, but she would learn. The winter had only just begun. The trouble came in layers the way winter comes to Montana. First a chill, then a frost, then the kind of cold that splits timber and kills livestock in their sleep. And by the time you understood what was happening, the snow was already chest deep and the doors were frozen shut. Edna Pickett was the first layer. Within a week of the wedding, she had turned Clara's arrival into the most discussed event in Elkhorn since the courthouse fire of 1874. The story changed shape with every telling, growing darker and more elaborate, but the core remained the same. Clara Whitfield was a liar, a schemer, and quite possibly worse. She had arrived with another man's child. She had deceived Silas Thornton. She was taking advantage of a grieving widower who had not been thinking clearly since Eleanor died. Clara discovered the extent of it on her first trip to town for supplies. She entered the general store, and three women who had been talking near the counter went silent. Not the polite silence of interrupted conversation. The deliberate silence of people who had been talking about the person who just walked in. Clara selected her items. Flour, salt, a spool of thread. She placed them on the counter. Edna rang them up without meeting her eyes, without greeting, without a single word. The transaction was completed in a silence so thick it had texture. Outside, Clara passed two women on the boardwalk. One of them pulled her daughter closer, steering the child around Clara as though proximity were a contamination. The other woman did not look at Clara at all. She looked through her the way people look through things they have decided do not exist. Clara walked back to the wagon Silas had lent her with her purchases in her arms and her spine so rigid it ached. She did not cry. She had stopped crying for herself months ago, but when she reached the wagon and set the bags down, she gripped the side rail and squeezed until her knuckles turned white. And for a moment, she stood there in the cold with her eyes closed and her teeth clenched, allowing herself exactly 10 seconds of fury before she climbed up and drove home. That evening, Silas found her at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold. Henry was asleep in the cradle. The house was quiet. Clara's face was composed, but something in the rigidity of her posture told Silas what her expression would not. He did not ask what happened. He was not a man equipped for that kind of conversation. But he poured hot water into a fresh cup, dropped a pinch of dried chamomile into it, and set it in front of her. Then he sat down across the table and stayed there. He did not speak. He did not reach for her hand. He simply sat in his presence, a kind of weight that said more than words. Clara looked at the fresh cup, then at him, and some of the tension in her shoulders released. Not all of it, but enough. They sat like that for a long time, with the fire popping and the wind pressing against the walls, and neither of them said a word. It was the first time Clara understood that Silas Thornton showed care not through language, but through proximity, through the act of staying when it would have been easier to leave the room. The second layer was Denton Graves. It began with the fences. 3 mornings after Graves's visit, Silas rode out to check the north pasture and found 200 yards of fence wire cut clean through. The cuts were precise, made with a tool not by weather or animal. 12 head of cattle had wandered through the gap overnight, scattering across the frozen rangeland. It took Silas and Hank Jessup 3 days to find them. 3 cows were dead frozen in a ravine where they had sheltered from the wind and could not climb out. Silas stood over the carcasses in the gray morning light, his jaw working, saying nothing. Hank kicked the snow beside him. "Graves," Hank said, "can't prove it. Don't need to prove it to know it." A week later, someone poured something foul into the horse trough. Silas discovered it when his best mare refused to drink, tossing her head and backing away from the water with flared nostrils. He smelled the trough and recoiled. The water had been poisoned with lye. Had the mare been less cautious, had she drunk before Silas noticed, the damage could have been devastating. Horses were not just labor on a ranch this size. They were survival. Again, no proof. No tracks that could not be explained by wind and snowfall. No witnesses. Graves was too careful for that. He operated through intermediaries and plausible deniability, the skills of a man who had spent years giving orders that were designed to be untraceable. The third layer was legal. A letter arrived by courier from the territorial office in Helena, informing Silas that a formal claim had been filed against his water rights to Clearwater Creek. The claimant was Denton Graves. The hearing would take place in 6 weeks before Judge Harlan Beckett, the circuit judge who visited Elkhorn quarterly. Graves had hired a lawyer from Butte, a man named Callister, who was known for his ability to make complicated things sound simple and wrong things sound right. Clara read the letter over Silas's shoulder. He had not offered it to her. She had taken it from the table where he left it because she had decided weeks ago that anything threatening this ranch was her business, whether Silas liked it or not. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" she asked. Her voice was calm but edged. Silas looked at her. "It wasn't your burden. It became my burden the moment I took your name. And Henry's future depends on this land. If you lose the water rights, you lose the ranch. If you lose the ranch, we have nothing. This is not something you carry alone." It was the first time Clara had directly challenged Silas, and the words hung between them with the electric quality of a change in weather. Silas stared at her. He was not accustomed to being challenged. He was accustomed to silence, obedience, and solitude. Clara offered none of these. "All right," he said after a long pause. "Then help me." Clara did. She spent 3 days going through every piece of paper in the house. Silas's father, Jedediah Thornton, had been a meticulous man, and his records filled an entire trunk beneath the stairs. Land deeds, cattle receipts, tax documents, correspondence with the territorial office, personal letters, and the accumulated paperwork of 20 years of ranching in Montana Territory. Clara organized it chronologically, cross-referenced names and dates, and built a picture of the ranch's legal history that was more complete than anything Silas himself could have reconstructed. She found the first piece of good news in a letter dated 1862 from the Montana Territory Land Office in Helena, addressed to Jedediah Thornton, confirming his water rights to Clearwater Creek as part of the original homestead survey. The letter was not the survey document itself, but it referenced the survey by number and date, which meant the original existed somewhere in official records. She found the second piece of news in a bundle of correspondence that had been tied with twine and shoved to the bottom of the trunk. These were older letters from the period when Jedediah Thornton and Denton Graves had been business associates rather than enemies. Among them was a receipt for a mining claim transfer in southern Illinois. The receipt was dated 18 months ago. The buyer was listed as D. Graves acting through an intermediary company. The seller's name was Thomas Whitfield. Clara's hand stopped moving. The paper trembled between her fingers. She read the name again. Thomas Whitfield. Her Thomas. Her husband. On a business document connected to Denton Graves filed among the papers of a ranch in Montana she had never heard of until 3 months ago. She sat on the floor beside the open trunk and stared at the receipt while the room seemed to tilt around her. Thomas had never mentioned selling a mining claim. Thomas had never mentioned anyone named Graves. But Thomas was dead killed in a mine collapse that had been ruled accidental, and now his name was on a piece of paper that linked him to the very man threatening to destroy Clara's new life. She needed to understand. She needed more information. She needed to know if this receipt was the beginning of a thread that, if pulled, would unravel something far worse than a land dispute. She went to Ruth Calloway. Ruth's cabin was a mile south of Thornton Ridge, a small, sturdy house surrounded by dormant gardens and a fence her late husband had built. Ruth was in her kitchen, boiling water for tea when Clara arrived with Henry bundled against the cold. Clara did not waste time. "What do you know about Denton Graves before he came to Elkhorn? Before the trouble with Silas?" Ruth set down the kettle. "Why do you ask?" "Because I found something in Jedediah's papers that I cannot explain, and I need to understand what kind of man we are dealing with." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down and began to talk. Graves had arrived in the valley 8 years ago with money ambition in a manner that made people want to trust him. He bought Graves Crossing from a family that had been bankrupted by drought, expanded it quickly, and established himself as a man of influence. But Ruth had noticed things, small things. The ranch hands who came and went with unusual frequency. The business trips to Illinois and Missouri that Graves never explained. The rumors never confirmed but never denied that Graves had interests in mining operations back east, and that the miners who worked those operations had a tendency toward misfortune. "There was a man," Ruth said carefully, "a few years back, a miner from Illinois who came through Elkhorn asking questions about Graves. He said his brother had died in a mine that Graves owned through a company with a different name. He said the mine had collapsed because the support beams were not properly maintained. He said his brother had been trying to sell his claim back to Graves, and Graves had refused to pay a fair price, and then the mine just happened to collapse." Clara's vision swam. "What happened to the man, the one asking questions?" "He left, or he was made to leave. I never saw him again." Clara rode home in silence. Henry slept against her chest, oblivious. The pieces were falling into place with a terrible clarity. Thomas had owned a mining claim. Graves had wanted it. Thomas had refused to sell or had sold under terms that did not satisfy Graves, and then Thomas had died in a mine collapse. An accident, the authorities had said. An accident that left a pregnant widow with nothing. Clara now lived in the house of a man whose father had once done business with the man who may have killed her husband. The document that connected them had been sitting in a trunk for months waiting for someone to find it. And the man responsible was circling this ranch like a wolf circles a wounded animal patient, and methodical, waiting for the right moment to strike. Clara did not tell Silas. Not yet. She needed certainty, not suspicion. She wrote a letter to the mining registry office in Springfield, Illinois, requesting records of Thomas Whitfield's claim and the circumstances of the mine's collapse. She gave the letter to Sheriff Ridley to send with the next mail coach, asking only that he keep the matter private. That night she lay awake with Henry sleeping beside her and the receipt hidden beneath her mattress, and she stared at the ceiling while 2 men occupied her mind. One dead, one alive. One she had loved, one she was beginning to understand. And a third man still breathing, still smiling, who connected them both through violence and greed. The blizzard arrived on a Tuesday. Clara had seen winter storms in Illinois, but nothing in her experience prepared her for what Montana could produce when it decided to be cruel. The sky turned the color of iron before dawn, and by noon the wind was screaming across the valley at 60 miles an hour, driving snow so thick and fast that the barn disappeared from view, though it stood only 40 yards from the house. Silas had been checking the north pasture when the storm hit. He barely made it back, riding half-blind through a wall of white, his horse stumbling on ice beneath the drifts. By the time he reached the barn, his coat was frozen stiff, and his fingers were numb inside his gloves. Hank Jessup was already there, having come in from the east fence when the sky changed color. The three of them, Silas, Hank, and Clara, worked for 6 hours to secure the livestock. Cattle had to be herded into the barn. Water troughs had to be filled before the pipes froze. Hay had to be distributed. Doors had to be reinforced against the wind, which hit the barn wall with a force that made the timbers groan. Clara worked without complaint and without pause. She hauled 50-pound bags of feed through snow that came up to her thighs. She calmed panicked horses with steady hands and a low, firm voice. When a pregnant cow refused to enter the barn, lowing in terror at the screaming wind, Clara waded out into the blizzard, grabbed the animal by the halter, and dragged her step by step through the drifts until the cow was inside. Hank Jessup watched this from the barn door, his mouth slightly open. He had spent 2 weeks dismissing Clara Whitfield Thornton as a burden, a city woman playing frontier wife, a mouth to feed who contributed nothing. He watched her drag a 600-pound cow through a blizzard, with her dress soaked and her hair frozen, and her face set in an expression of absolute determination, and he revised every opinion he had ever held. He did not say this. He was not any more than Silas, a man of many words. But when Clara finally got the cow into the barn and leaned against the wall, panting, trembling with cold and exhaustion, Hank brought her a horse blanket and draped it over her shoulders. He did not meet her eyes. He just did it and walked away. And Clara understood the gesture for what it was, an apology and an acknowledgement delivered in the only language these men spoke. It was near dark when they finished securing the animals and made it back to the house. The wind had not lessened. If anything, it had grown worse, hammering the walls with a fury that made conversation difficult even indoors. Hank bunked in the front room near the fire. Silas and Clara moved through the house, checking windows, banking the stove, and making sure every possible source of heat was maximized. Henry had been sleeping in his cradle through the worst of it, but as the temperature inside the house dropped despite the fire, the baby began to fuss. Clara picked him up and felt the heat radiating from his small body before she even touched his forehead. The fever was sudden and high. Henry's skin was flushed, his breathing rapid and shallow, his cries thin and reedy, lacking the robust wail of a healthy infant. Clara had feared this since the day he was born. The doctor in Illinois had warned her. Born 3 weeks early, underweight lungs not fully developed. A winter illness could be dangerous. In the right conditions, it could be fatal. Clara held him and felt the world narrow to a single point. Nothing else existed, not the storm, not graves, not the ranch, not the hearing. Only this child, this impossible small life, burning with fever in her arms. "Silas," she said, and her voice broke the way it almost never did. "He's burning up. Silas, he's burning up." Silas crossed the room in 3 strides. He touched Henry's forehead and his hand pulled back as if scalded. The heat was alarming. He looked at Clara, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that she recognized. Not calm, not control, fear. "Doc Marsh," he said. "I'll ride to town." "No," Clara caught his arm. Her grip was stronger than he expected. "Eleanor died on a road like this. I won't let you die the same way." The words hung in the room like smoke. Hank by the fire went very still. Silas stared at Clara, and she watched the war play out across his face. The instinct to act. The memory of what acting had cost him before. Eleanor riding into a storm because Silas was not there. Eleanor lying in the snow with hands folded over a belly that would never hold life again. He could not go. If he went, he might die. If he died, Clara and Henry would be alone, and the ranch would fall, and Grays would take everything. But if he stayed and the fever took Henry, he would have failed again. He would have stood inside a warm house while a child died the same way he had stood inside a warm barn while his wife died on a frozen road. "Stay," Clara said, her voice steady now, though her eyes were wet. "Stay and help me fight this. We do not need a doctor tonight. We need each other." Silas looked at Henry. The baby's eyes were glassy, unfocused, but his tiny hand reached out and found Silas's finger wrapping around it with a grip that was weak but insistent. Silas felt that grip like a hook in his chest, pulling at something buried so deep he had forgotten it was there. He stayed. They worked through the night. Clara nursed Henry with warm water and diluted milk, keeping his fluids up, wiping his body with cloths dampened in lukewarm water to bring the fever down. Silas kept the fire burning at a steady heat, not too hot, not too cold, adjusting the damper with a precision born of years reading Weather and Flame. He boiled herbs that Ruth Calloway had given him months ago for livestock ailments, chamomile and willow bark, and Clara used the cooled liquid to moisten Henry's lips. The baby cried. Then he stopped crying, which was worse. Then he cried again, weaker this time, and Clara held him against her chest and rocked him, her lips moving in a lullaby that had no melody, just words whispered into the dark. Hank sat by the front door with a rifle across his knees, watching the storm through the window, as if by guarding the house from the outside world, he could protect the fragile life within it. He did not sleep. He did not speak. He simply kept watch. At 3 in the morning, the fever peaked. Henry's body went rigid in Clara's arms, his face contorted, and for a moment she thought she was losing him. She pressed her mouth to his forehead and whispered things she would never remember afterward, promises and prayers, in the name of every person she had ever loved, as if the weight of those names could hold him to the earth. Silas knelt beside her. He put his hand on Henry's back, his palm covering nearly the entire span of the baby's body, and held it there. He could feel the tiny ribs expanding and contracting. He could feel the heartbeat rapid and frantic like a bird trapped under glass. "Come on," Silas whispered. "Come on, boy. Stay." The fever broke near dawn. It did not break dramatically with a sudden cooling of the skin or a triumphant cry. It faded slowly the way a storm fades, the temperature dropping degree by degree until Henry's breathing slowed and deepened, and his body went limp with the boneless exhaustion of an infant who has fought something enormous and won. Clara collapsed beside the cradle, her head on the edge of the quilt, her hand still resting on Henry's chest. She was asleep in seconds, the kind of sleep that comes when the body simply refuses to remain conscious one moment longer. Silas sat beside her on the floor. He looked at Clara, he looked at Henry, and for the first time in 2 years, tears fell from his eyes. They slid down his weathered cheeks without sound, without sobs, just a quiet release of something that had been locked inside him since the day he buried Eleanor and their daughter in the frozen ground behind the house. He reached out and touched Henry's head, his rough fingers infinitely gentle on the baby's soft hair. "Stay," he whispered again. "Both of you, stay." Clara heard him. She was not fully asleep, floating in that borderland between consciousness and oblivion, and the word reached her through layers of exhaustion. Stay. Not a command, a plea. The first vulnerability Silas Thornton had allowed himself in 2 years, spoken to a sleeping woman and a sick child in the gray light of a winter dawn. She did not open her eyes, but she heard him, and her own tears, silent and warm, soaked into the edge of the quilt. Doc Emmett Marsh arrived the next morning after the storm cleared enough to travel. He was a thin man with spectacles and hands that never shook, and he examined Henry with the thoroughness of someone who understood that infant mortality on the frontier was not a statistic but a daily reality. "The boy is past the worst," he said, putting his stethoscope back in his bag. "Lungs are clear. Fever is down. Your wife did well." He said it to Silas, but his eyes lingered on Clara, who stood by the stove with her arms crossed and her face gray with fatigue. "That woman saved your boy's life," Doc Marsh said quietly, low enough that Clara could not hear. "Don't be a fool, Thornton. Whatever arrangement you two have, she's worth more than the terms you've set." Silas said nothing, but he heard. Hank Jessup came inside a few minutes later, stamping snow from his boots, and surveyed the scene. Silas, red-eyed and unshaven, his shirt wrinkled from a night on the floor. Clara barely standing, her hair undone, dark circles beneath her eyes. And Henry, pink-cheeked and peaceful in his cradle, sucking contentedly on a rag dipped in warm milk. Hank looked at the parents, if that word applied, and at the baby who seemed entirely unconcerned with the ordeal he had caused. A crooked smile broke across his face. "Came to check on the calf," he said. "But the calf seems to be doing better than the both of you." Silas made a sound that might have been a laugh. It was small, rusty with disuse, and over almost before it began. But it was real. After the fever, after the storm, after the night that nearly broke them, something changed in the Thornton house. The change was not sudden, and it was not announced. It moved through the rooms like warmth from a well-tended fire, gradual, steady, and impossible to ignore once you noticed it. Silas began to speak at meals. Not speeches, Not confessions, small things. A story about his father teaching him to break horses. An observation about the way the light hit the western ridge at sunset. A memory of his first winter on the ranch when he was 14, and the world seemed too large and too cold and too empty to survive. Clara listened the way she did everything with attention and without interruption. She asked questions at the right moments, the kind of questions that showed she was not just hearing his words, but understanding what lay behind them. Silas carved more toys for Henry. A small wooden cow, a star, a tiny wagon with wheels that turned. Each piece was more detailed than the last, as if his hands were remembering a skill that his heart had forbidden them to practice. Clara arranged them on the shelf beside the cradle in a careful row, and every evening Silas glanced at the shelf as he passed, verifying they were still there, still kept still, valued. One evening when Henry would not stop crying, and Clara was so tired her hands shook, Silas took the baby from her arms without being asked. He held Henry against his chest and walked the length of the room, back and forth, humming something low and tuneless that might once have been a hymn. Henry's crying softened, then faded, then stopped entirely. The baby slept against Silas's shoulder. One small hand curled against the collar of his shirt. Clara stood in the doorway of her room watching. She said nothing. Silas did not know she was there. She watched this man, this broken-guarded, silent man holding her son with a tenderness so careful it looked like pain, and she understood something she had not been prepared for. Silas Thornton was not merely tolerating Henry. He loved him. He had loved him since the night the fever almost took him, perhaps before, perhaps since the moment those tiny fingers first wrapped around his own. He loved the boy, and he was terrified of that love because the last time he had loved a child, that child had died before drawing a single breath. The evening that changed everything between them came without warning. Henry was asleep. The fire was low. Clara sat in the rocking chair she had claimed as her own, mending a sock. Silas sat in his chair, a piece of wood in his hands, carving something she could not yet identify. He spoke without looking up. "I didn't marry you out of pity." Clara's needle stopped. "I know. You married me because you needed someone to survive the winter with." Silas shook his head, slowly, once. "No." He was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. His knife moved along the wood. "When you walked through that gate with the boy, I saw something I hadn't seen in 2 years." Clara waited. "A reason," he said. He set down the knife in the wood and stood up and walked outside into the cold without another word. Clara sat motionless in the rocking chair, the sock forgotten in her lap, her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that frightened her. A reason. Not a convenience. Not a transaction. A reason to keep going. A reason to open the door. A reason to let the cradle hold a child again. Clara pressed her hand to her chest and breathed until the shaking stopped. Then she picked up the sock and continued mending, because that was what she did. She endured. She worked. And she kept her heart under control, because losing control was a luxury she could not yet afford. But something had shifted, and they both knew it. Denton Graves came again on a cold morning 2 weeks before the hearing. He brought 4 men this time. 3 of them were strangers to Clara hired guns, with the flat eyes and quiet hands of men accustomed to violence. The 4th was Virgil Poole, who hung back near the horses with an expression Clara could not read. Graves dismounted at the gate and walked toward the house with the confidence of a man entering his own property. Silas met him on the porch. Clara stood in the doorway behind him, Henry in her arms. "I've come to make this simple," Graves said. "Sign over the water rights to Clearwater Creek, and all of this unpleasantness goes away. No hearing, no lawyers, no more trouble." "No," Silas said. Graves tilted his head. "Think carefully, Thornton. The hearing will not go well for you. My lawyer has documents. I have witnesses. You have a trunk full of old letters and a wife who arrived 3 weeks ago." He paused, letting the last word carry its full weight of dismissal. Then he turned to Clara. His voice changed, becoming softer, more intimate, the voice of a man sharing a confidence. "I knew your husband, Mrs. Thornton. Thomas Whitfield. Good man. Stubborn but good. We had business together back in Illinois. Mining business." He paused. "It's a shame what happened to him in that mine. A real shame." Clara's face went white. She felt her arms tighten around Henry. She felt the blood drain from her extremities, as if her body were preparing for a blow. And the debts he left behind? Graves continued, his tone sorrowful, his eyes calculating. A man's debts don't die with him, Mrs. Thornton. They pass to his wife, and now, I suppose, to his wife's new husband. He looked at Silas. Something to consider. Silas stepped forward. The movement was small, a single pace, but it carried a force that made Graves's men shift their weight. Get off my land, Silas said. Now. Graves raised both hands. The performance of innocence. Just a conversation between neighbors. He mounted his horse, touched his hat, and rode away with his men trailing behind him. Virgil Poole was the last to leave. He paused at the gate and looked back at Clara. Their eyes met for a moment, and Clara saw something in his face that did not match the others. Not cruelty, not indifference, something closer to doubt. Then he was gone. Silas turned to Clara. The gentleness of recent weeks was gone from his face. In its place was the hard expression of a man who has been blindsided. What debts? What haven't you told me? Clara set Henry in his cradle. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and told Silas everything. Thomas and the mine, the collapse that killed him, the ruling of accidental death that never felt right, the receipt she found in Jedediah's papers linking Thomas to Graves, Ruth Calloway's stories about miners who refused to sell and met misfortune, the letter she had sent to Springfield requesting records. I believe Graves killed my husband, Clara said, or had him killed. I believe the mine collapse was deliberate, and I believe the same man who murdered Thomas is now trying to take your land. Silas stood by the window, his back to her, and the silence in the room was absolute. When he spoke, his voice was controlled but tight, the voice of a man holding his temper by the thinnest of threads. You should have told me. I needed to be sure before I dragged you into my past. Your past became mine the day you took my name. That's how this works, Clara. It was not the words that undid her. It was the name. He had called her Clara. Not Mrs. Thornton, not woman, Clara. And the way he said it carried not just anger, but ownership, the ownership of a man who has accepted that his life is now bound to another's, and who is furious not because she lied, but because she carried the weight alone when she did not have to. Clara stood. She walked to him. She placed her hand on his arm lightly, the way you touch something that might break. I'm sorry, she said. I was afraid, not of you, of what this knowledge might cost us. Silas turned. His eyes, that storm gray that could be so cold, were not cold now. They were burning. We face this together, he said. Whatever Graves brings, whatever the judge decides, whatever happened to Thomas, we face it as one. Do you understand? Yes. He covered her hand with his. His palm was rough, calloused, warm. It was the first time he had touched her deliberately, not out of necessity, but out of choice. The first time the boundary between arrangement and something else had been crossed by conscious decision. Together, Clara said. Together, Silas said. The fire burned low. Henry slept. And in the quiet of that room, the marriage that had been forged in desperation was reforged in trust. The peace lasted 11 days. On a Tuesday night, 3 weeks before the hearing, Clara was woken by the sound of screaming horses. She bolted upright, and through the bedroom window, she saw the barn engulfed in flames. Orange light poured through the open doors and licked along the roof timbers, throwing grotesque shadows across the snow. Silas was already running. He wore only trousers and boots, his torso bare to the freezing air, and he hit the barn door at full speed, hauling it open and plunging into the smoke. Hank Jessup was seconds behind him. Clara wrapped Henry, placed him in the cradle, whispered, "Stay," as if the word could hold him safe, and ran outside. The heat was staggering. Even 30 feet from the barn, the air burned her face. Inside, horses screamed and kicked at their stalls. Silas and Hank worked frantically, cutting halters, dragging animals through the smoke. Clara grabbed a bucket from the water pump and began dousing the flames nearest the door, a futile gesture against the inferno, but the only one available. They saved 8 horses. They lost 4. The barn roof collapsed 20 minutes after the fire was discovered, sending a column of sparks into the black sky that could be seen from Elkhorn. Silas emerged from the wreckage with burns on his right hand and left shoulder. His skin was blistered and raw, and he clenched his jaw against the pain with a stubbornness that alarmed Clara more than the injuries themselves. She wrapped his hand and shoulder with clean cloth and salve from Doc Marsh's supplies, working quickly and efficiently. not allowing herself to think about how close the fire had come to the house. To Henry. Sheriff Ridley arrived at dawn having seen the glow from his office window. He surveyed the damage, asked questions, and wrote notes in a small book. There was no evidence linking the fire to Graves. No tracks that the snow had not already covered. No witnesses. "I know who did this," Silas said. "So do I," Ridley replied. "But knowing and proving are different things in a court of law, Thornton. And Graves has a lawyer who understands that difference better than either of us." Over the next 3 days, the situation deteriorated further. A letter arrived from Graves's lawyer informing Judge Beckett that Clara Whitfield Thornton's identity was under question and requesting an investigation into whether the marriage was fraudulent. If the judge accepted the challenge, the marriage could be annulled. Clara would lose her legal status as Silas's wife. Henry would lose the Thornton name, and Clara's testimony in the water rights hearing would become inadmissible. Edna Pickett, upon hearing this development, organized a letter signed by 11 women of Elkhorn requesting that Judge Beckett investigate Clara's background before ruling on any matter involving the Thornton estate. The letter described Clara as a woman of unknown origin and dubious character. Everything was falling apart. The barn was gone. Silas was injured. The legal case was weakening. The community was turning, and Graves, patient and methodical, was tightening his grip from every direction at once. Clara sat at the kitchen table with the wreckage of their situation spread before her and made the hardest calculation of her life. She could leave. If she left, Graves would lose his leverage against Silas. The questions about her identity would evaporate. The hearing would become a straightforward land dispute which Silas might win on the strength of Jedediah's letter alone. Her departure would simplify everything. She said it aloud. "If I leave, Graves loses his weapon against you. You keep the land, the ranch, your name." Silas, his hand bandaged, his face haggard from pain and sleepless nights, looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. It was not anger. It was not resignation. It was something between fury and heartbreak, the face of a man who has been told the thing he fears most as if it were a reasonable suggestion. "You walk out that door," he said, "and I lose more than any ranch is worth." Clara stared at him. The words settled into her chest and took root there, deep and permanent. She had come to this ranch as a transaction. She had stayed as a partner, and now she understood fully and without doubt that she had become something else entirely. Something this man could not lose without losing himself. She did not leave. Instead, she made a plan. Ruth Calloway had mentioned weeks ago that Jedediah Thornton once sent copies of his land survey documents to the federal post office in Helena for safekeeping. If those copies still existed, they would carry official seals and federal authentication that no amount of Graves's forgery could overcome. "I'll go to Helena," Clara said. "The survey copies are there, federal records. Graves cannot forge those." Silas shook his head. "It's 3 days' ride, in winter. You can't go alone. You cannot leave the ranch unguarded. And you cannot ride with those Burns. Hank can stay with you. Ruth will take Henry." She met his eyes. "Graves is watching you, not me. I can travel without being followed." Silas was quiet for a long time. Through the window, the ruins of the barn smoked in the morning light. His hand throbbed beneath its bandage. The house felt small and exposed and vulnerable. "This is how Eleanor died," he said quietly, "riding out alone, into a storm." Clara crossed the room to him. She stood close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath. She put her hand on his face, her fingers light against his jaw, and she looked into his eyes with a directness that left no room for doubt. "I am not Eleanor," she said. "I will come back. I promise you that." Silas leaned into her friend for just a moment. His eyes closed. When they opened, the fear was still there, but beneath it was something stronger. Trust. "Go," he said. "Find what we need and come back to me." Clara rode out at dawn the next morning on the strongest horse remaining. Her saddlebag held documents, a change of clothing, food for 3 days, and the receipt with Thomas Whitfield's name, the thread she intended to pull, until the whole rotten tapestry unraveled. Silas stood at the gate and watched her ride north until she was nothing but a dark shape against the white horizon, growing smaller with every stride, until she disappeared entirely behind the rise of the hill. He stood there long after she was gone. The wind pushed against him. The cold bit at his bandaged hand. The silence of the valley pressed in from every side. Then he turned and went inside where Henry was waiting with Ruth, and he picked up his son with his good arm and held him close and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the empty road had not already said for him. He had let her go, just as he had let Eleanor go 2 years ago into a storm. But this time was different. This time the woman who rode out had looked him in the eye and made a promise. And Silas Thornton, against every instinct that grief had taught him, chose to believe her. The waiting began. The road to Helena was a study in endurance. Clara rode north through a landscape so vast and so empty, it seemed designed to remind a person of their insignificance. The mountains rose on either side of the valley like the walls of a corridor, built by something older than human ambition, their peaks white with snow, their flanks dark with pine forests that went on for miles without a single break. The sky above was the color of tin, low and featureless, pressing down on the land with a weight that was not physical but felt that way. She rode for 10 hours the first day, stopping only to water the horse and eat a strip of dried beef from her saddlebag. The cold was relentless. It found every gap in her clothing, every inch of exposed skin, every breath she drew. Her fingers went numb inside her gloves by mid-morning, and by afternoon the numbness had crept up to her wrists. She flexed her hands constantly, squeezing the reins, making fists, keeping the blood moving through sheer stubbornness. She thought about Henry. She thought about the way his fingers curled when he slept, the way his mouth opened in a small circle of surprise when something caught his attention, the weight of him against her chest, warm and alive and utterly dependent. She thought about his fever the night she had almost lost him, and the way Silas had knelt beside her in the dark and whispered, "Stay," as if the word itself could hold a child to the earth. She thought about Silas, the coat he had put over her shoulders the first day, the cradle he had given without a word, the toys he carved in firelight when he thought no one was watching, the way he had said her name, Clara, not Mrs. Thornton, not woman, but Clara, and the way that single word had contained more feeling than any declaration she had ever heard. She thought about Thomas, her first husband, the man she had married at 19 in a church in Springfield with daisies in her hair and a certainty that the world was fundamentally kind. Thomas, who had worked in the mines because the pay was good and the work was honest, who had come home each evening with dust in his hair and a smile that could light a room, who had held her hand the night she told him about the baby and said, "We are going to be just fine." Thomas, who had gone to work one morning and never come home, buried under 1,000 tons of rock in a mine that should not have collapsed in an accident that was not an accident. She carried all of them with her on that road, the living and the dead, the man she had lost and the man she was fighting to keep, the child sleeping in a walnut cradle 100 miles behind her, and the justice that had been denied for too long. On the second night, she camped in a stand of pines beside a frozen creek building, a small fire that threw more shadow than light. The horse stood nearby, breathing plumes of white into the darkness. Clara sat with her back against a tree and her rifle across her knees and did not sleep. Every sound in the forest, every crack of a branch, every shift of snow, sliding from a bough brought her upright with her hand on the stock. She reached Helena on the afternoon of the third day. The federal post office was a stone building on the main street, solid and unremarkable, staffed by a clerk with wire spectacles and ink-stained fingers, who looked at Clara with the mild surprise of a man who did not often receive visitors covered in trail dust and frozen mud. Clara presented her request. She was looking for copies of a land survey filed by Jedediah Thornton of Elkhorn, Montana Territory, dated approximately 1858, pertaining to the homestead known as Thornton Ridge, and including water rights to Clearwater Creek. The clerk disappeared into a back room. Clara waited. She stood at the counter with her hands flat on the wood and her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. If the copies were gone, if they had been lost or destroyed or misfiled, then everything she had risked was for nothing. 20 minutes passed. 30. Clara's fingers tightened on the counter's edge. The clerk returned carrying a leather portfolio tied with cord. He set it on the counter and opened it, and Clara saw the documents inside and felt her knees go weak. The survey was there, 2 copies each bearing the official seal of the Montana Territory Land Office and the signature of the federal surveyor who had conducted the original assessment. The documents confirmed in clear and unambiguous language that the water rights to Clearwater Creek had been granted to Jedediah Thornton as part of the original homestead claim in 1858, and that those rights were attached to the land itself, transferable only through legal sale of the property. But there was more. Filed alongside the survey was a record of correspondence between the land office and a party identified as D. Graves, dated 2 years earlier. In the correspondence, Graves had attempted to purchase the water rights through a third-party intermediary, a company called Western Range Holdings. The land office had denied the request on the grounds that the rights belonged to the Thornton homestead and could not be separated from the property. Graves had known. 2 years before filing his claim with Judge Beckett, he had been told in writing by the territorial government that the water rights were not his to take. He had filed his lawsuit anyway, using forged documents and perjured witnesses, knowing full well that his claim was fraudulent. Clara held the papers and felt something shift inside her. Not just relief, not just vindication, something harder and colder. Certainty. The certainty that Denton Graves was not merely a greedy neighbor disputing a boundary. He was a man who operated outside the law with deliberate calculation, who fabricated evidence and corrupted legal processes, and who, if Virgil Poole and Ruth Calloway's stories were true, was willing to kill when other methods failed. She paid the clerk for certified copies, wrapped the originals in oilcloth, and placed them in her saddlebag with the same care she would have used for a newborn child. Then she bought fresh provisions, watered the horse, and rode south. The encounter happened on the second day of the return journey in a narrow pass between two ridges where the road threaded through stands of bare aspen. Clara heard the horse before she saw it, the sound of hooves on frozen ground coming from ahead, steady and unhurried. She pulled her rifle from its scabbard and rested it across the saddle. The rider appeared around the bend, a lean man on a gray horse dressed in a long coat with a hat pulled low over his face. Virgil Poole. Clara's hands tightened on the rifle. Virgil reined his horse to a stop 20 feet away. His hands were visible, resting on the saddle horn. He carried no weapon in his hands, though Clara could see the revolver on his hip. They regarded each other across the frozen space. Wind moved through the aspens, rattling the bare branches. "Mrs. Thornton," Virgil said. His voice was flat quiet, carrying no inflection that Clara could use to judge his intent. "Mr. Poole, I'm not here to stop you." "Then why are you here?" Virgil was silent for a moment. His horse shifted beneath him, and he steadied it with a subtle movement of his knees. "Because there's something you need to know, and I've decided I'd rather tell it than carry it." Clara waited. The rifle did not move from its position across her saddle. "I was there when your husband died," Virgil said. "In the mine, in Illinois. It wasn't an accident." The words reached Clara through the cold air and struck something inside her that she had been protecting for months. A fragile membrane of uncertainty, the thin wall between suspicion and knowledge, between fearing the worst and knowing it for fact. That wall broke. "Tell me," she said. Virgil looked away toward the ridge, as if what he was about to say required him to address the landscape rather than the woman before him. "Graves wanted the mining claim. Your husband owned it. Graves offered to buy. Your husband refused. Graves offered again a lower price with an implication that refusing would be unwise. Your husband refused again." He paused. His jaw worked. "Graves told me to arrange for the support beams in the lower shaft to be weakened. Not removed. Weakened. The idea was that the shaft would become unsafe, the mine would be shut down, and your husband would have no choice but to sell. It was supposed to be pressure, not murder." Another pause. Longer this time. The beams gave way faster than anyone expected. The whole lower shaft came down in less than a minute. Your husband was at the face. He never had a chance. Clara sat motionless on her horse. Her vision blurred and she blinked it clear. The rifle trembled in her grip and she steadied it through force of will. "You were there. I was there. You could have warned him. I could have." Virgil met her eyes now, and what Clara saw in them was not defiance, but a desolation so complete it was almost peaceful. The look of a man who has passed beyond guilt into something emptier. "I didn't. I followed orders. And a man died because I was too much of a coward to say no. Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Graves is going to destroy your family the same way he destroyed yours before. And I've done things for that man I can't undo. But I can do this. I can tell the truth. And I can stand in front of a judge and say it again under oath if you need me to." Clara stared at him. Her hands were shaking. Whether from cold or rage or grief, she could not tell. Probably all three. I don't need your guilt, she said. And I don't need your redemption. I need your testimony. Will you come to Elkhorn? Will you stand before Judge Beckett and say what you just said to me? Virgil looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded once. I'll be there. He turned his horse and rode back the way he had come, disappearing around the bend without another word. Clara sat in the empty pass with the wind howling around her and the rifle still across her saddle, and Thomas's face in her mind, his smile, his dust-covered hair, his hand on her belly the night she told him about the baby, and she allowed herself 30 seconds. 30 seconds to close her eyes and let the grief and the fury wash through her like a flood. 30 seconds to mourn the man she had loved and lost, and to acknowledge finally and completely that his death had not been fate. It had been murder. Then she opened her eyes, adjusted the saddlebag containing the documents that would save her family, and rode south toward Thornton Ridge. She rode through the night. Silas saw her coming from the porch, a dark shape against the white hills growing larger with each stride of the horse. He had been standing there for 2 hours, as he had stood there every morning and evening since she left, watching the northern road for a sign of her return. He came down the steps and reached the gate as she dismounted. He saw the exhaustion in her face, the windburn on her cheeks, the set of her jaw that he had come to recognize as the expression she wore when she had done something difficult and refused to acknowledge the difficulty. He saw the saddlebag heavy with documents, and he saw her eyes, which were red but dry and carried a fire that had not been there when she left. I found everything, Clara said. Graves is finished. Silas reached for her, not for the saddlebag, not for the horse's reins, but for her. His good hand found the back of her neck and pulled her forward until her forehead rested against his chest. She stood there for a moment, breathing, feeling the solid warmth of him, the smell of wood smoke and leather, and the salve on his bandaged hand. She did not cry. She was beyond crying, but she leaned into him and let herself be held, and that was enough. Then she stepped back and told him everything. The survey documents from Helena, the federal correspondence proving Graves knew his claim was fraudulent, and Virgil Poole standing in a frozen pass confessing that Thomas Whitfield had been murdered on Denton Graves's orders. Silas listened without interrupting. His face darkened as the story unfolded, the muscles in his jaw tightening, his gray eyes narrowing until they were nearly closed. When Clara finished, the silence in the room was dense enough to feel. He killed your husband, Silas said. His voice was very low and very controlled, the voice of a man holding something explosive with careful hands. And you rode back through winter to save a ranch belonging to a man you've known for 3 months. I rode back because this is my home, Clara said. You are my home, Henry's home. I will not let Denton Graves take one more thing from me. Silas lifted his hand and placed it against her cheek. His fingers were rough and warm and infinitely gentle. Clara felt the calluses against her skin, felt the slight tremor in his touch, and understood that this was not a gesture of comfort, but of surrender. Silas Thornton, who had built walls around himself for 2 years, who had written no sentiment, required in an advertisement, because sentiment was the thing that had nearly destroyed him, was standing in his kitchen with his hand on a woman's face and his defenses in ruins. They stood close enough to feel each other's breath, close enough that the distance between arrangement and love had narrowed to nothing. There was no kiss, not yet, but the space between them held more intimacy than any touch, because it was a space both of them had chosen to close. They prepared for the hearing. Clara organized the evidence into a sequence that told a story: the original survey, the federal correspondence, the forged documents Graves had filed, and Virgil Poole's testimony tying everything together with the threat of a murdered man. Sheriff Ridley came to the ranch and reviewed the materials. He confirmed that a letter had arrived from the mining registry in Springfield corroborating the existence of Thomas Whitfield's claim and the circumstances of the mine's collapse. This is enough, Ridley said, for the water rights and then some. Beckett is a fair judge. He'll see it. The hearing was set for the following Thursday. Judge Harlan Beckett arrived in Elkhorn on a Wednesday afternoon riding in a covered wagon that served as his traveling office. He was 58 years old with a white beard trimmed close to his jaw, eyes the color of creek water, and a reputation for fairness that was exceeded only by his reputation for impatience with liars. He had been riding the circuit through Montana Territory for 19 years, and in that time he had developed an instinct for dishonesty that was almost physical. He could feel a lie the way some men feel a change in weather. The hearing took place in the Elkhorn Town Hall, a single-room building with a plank floor, a raised platform at one end that served as a bench, and enough chairs to seat 40 people. Every chair was full. The entire town had come. Ranchers, shopkeepers, ranch hands, wives, children old enough to sit still. They filled the room with the particular energy of people who have been talking about something for weeks and are finally about to see it resolved. Denton Graves sat at a table on the left side of the room, flanked by his lawyer Callister, a man with pomaded hair and the smooth, practiced smile of someone who sells confidence by the hour. Graves wore his best coat and an expression of patient righteousness, the expression of a man who believes the outcome is already decided in his favor. Silas and Clara sat at a table on the right. Silas's hand was still bandaged, the burns healing, but not yet healed. Clara wore a clean dress, her copper hair pinned back, Henry on her lap. The baby was awake, his dark eyes moving around the room with the unfocused curiosity of an infant for whom everything is spectacle. Judge Beckett called the hearing to order. Graves's lawyer presented first. Callister was good. His voice was measured and persuasive, his manner confident without being arrogant. He laid out Graves's claim with the precision of a man constructing a building, each piece fitting neatly atop the last. He presented documents purporting to show a transfer of water rights from a previous owner to Graves. He called 3 witnesses, local men who testified that they had seen the boundary markers along Clearwater Creek and that those markers indicated Graves's property extended to include the water source. He argued that Jedediah Thornton's original survey was outdated, possibly inaccurate, and that the absence of the original document from Silas's possession suggested it had been superseded by more recent filings. It was a compelling performance. Beckett listened with his hands folded, his expression neutral. The crowd murmured. Clara watched the judge's face and felt a cold thread of worry. Callister was constructing a narrative that was wrong in every particular, but felt right, and that was often more dangerous than the truth. Silas presented next. He stood his tall frame rigid and spoke in the plain, unadorned language of a man who did not know how to lie convincingly. He described his father's homestead, the original survey, the water rights that had sustained the ranch for 20 years. He presented the letter from the Montana Territory Land Office referencing the survey. He spoke about the cut fences, the poisoned trough, the burned barn, none of which he could prove were connected to Graves, but all of which he laid before the judge as context. Beckett listened. His expression did not change. When Silas finished, the judge looked at the letter and said, "This references a survey, but is not the survey itself. Do you have the original document?" Silas hesitated. "No, Your Honor. The original has been misplaced." Graves's lawyer smiled. The crowd shifted. The cold thread in Clara's chest pulled tighter. Then Clara stood. The room went quiet. Judge Beckett looked at her with the raised eyebrow of a man unaccustomed to interruptions, but willing to tolerate one if it proved worthwhile. "Your Honor," Clara said. Her voice was steady. It carried across the room with the clarity of a bell struck in cold air. "My name is Clara Thornton. I am the legal wife of Silas Thornton and a resident of Thornton Ridge. I have additional evidence to present." Beckett regarded her for a moment. "Proceed, Mrs. Thornton." Clara walked to the judge's platform and placed the leather portfolio on the bench. She opened it and laid out the survey documents one by one with the deliberate care of a woman who understood the weight of what she carried. These are certified copies of the original Thornton Homestead Survey filed with the Federal Post Office in Helena in 1858 by Jedediah Thornton. They bear the official seal of the Montana Territory Land Office and the signature of the federal surveyor who conducted the assessment. She pointed to the relevant passages. The survey confirms that water rights to Clearwater Creek were granted to the Thornton homestead as part of the original claim. These rights are attached to the land and cannot be separated or transferred except through legal sale of the property itself. Beckett examined the documents. He held them up to the light, checked the seals, read the signatures. His expression remained neutral, but Clara saw his eyes sharpen with the particular focus of a man who recognizes authentic documents when he sees them. "These appear to be in order," he said. Clara was not finished. She reached into the portfolio and produced a second set of documents, the correspondence between the Montana Territory Land Office and Denton Graves. "Your Honor, these are records from the federal office in Helena showing that Mr. Graves attempted to purchase the Clearwater Creek water rights through a company called Western Range Holdings approximately 2 years ago. The land office denied the request in writing, stating that the rights belonged to the Thornton homestead and could not be separated from the property. She placed the documents before the judge. Mr. Graves was informed in writing by the territorial government that his claim to these water rights had no legal basis. He filed the current lawsuit anyway, using documents that contradict the official federal record. The room erupted, chairs scraped, voices rose. Graves's lawyer was on his feet objecting, but his voice was drowned by the noise. Graves himself sat rigid, his face drained of color, his carefully constructed expression of righteousness crumbling like wet paper. Judge Beckett struck the table with his gavel 3 times. "Order, I will have order." The room settled, though the energy in it had changed entirely. The crowd was no longer passive. They were watching Graves with new eyes. Edna Pickett chose this moment to stand. She rose from her chair in the second row, her spine straight, her chin lifted, her voice carrying the particular authority of a woman who has appointed herself the moral arbiter of her community. "Your Honor, if I may speak as a concerned citizen." Beckett looked at her with undisguised impatience. "This is a legal hearing, that Mrs. Pickett, not a town meeting." "I understand, Your Honor, but I believe it is relevant to inform the court that Mrs. Thornton's character has been a subject of concern in this community. She arrived under questionable circumstances with a child of uncertain parentage, and there are those of us who believe her testimony should be weighed against her reputation." The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Clara felt the ripple of them, felt the eyes of the town turning toward her, felt the old familiar weight of judgment pressing against her chest. Clara turned to face Edna. She did not raise her voice. She did not point or gesture. She stood with her hands at her sides and spoke with a calm that was more devastating than any shout. "Mrs. Pickett, you called me a fraud. You told this town I was not worthy of the Thornton name. You organized letters questioning my character. You did all of this without once speaking to me, without once asking who I was, where I came from, or what I had endured to stand where I am standing now." The room was silent. Edna's face reddened. "I walked 3 weeks from Illinois with a baby in my arms. I arrived in this valley with nothing but a valise and the name of a man I had never met. I survived a blizzard, tended livestock, nursed my child through a fever that nearly killed him, and rode 3 days to Helena and back to save this ranch. I have cooked, cleaned, mended, hauled, planted, and labored every day since I arrived, not because I was asked to, but because it needed doing." Clara paused. Her eyes did not leave Edna's. "What have you done for this community, Mrs. Pickett, besides talk?" No one spoke. Edna Pickett, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, had no response. She lowered herself back into her chair with the mechanical stiffness of a woman whose legs have stopped obeying her will. Ruth Calloway, seated 3 rows back, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Judge Beckett cleared his throat. "Mrs. Thornton, do you have anything further?" Clara turned back to the judge. The fire in her eyes did not diminish. If anything, it burned brighter. "Yes, Your Honor. One more matter." She drew a breath. "I have reason to believe that Mr. Graves is responsible for the death of my first husband, Thomas Whitfield, who died in a mining accident in Illinois last spring. A witness to the events has come forward and is prepared to testify." The room, which had been stirring with whispers, went absolutely still. Graves surged to his feet. His chair scraped back across the plank floor with a sound like a scream. "This is outrageous. This woman is a liar and a manipulator. She has no standing to make accusations of this nature in a water rights hearing." Judge Beckett's gavel came down hard. "Sit down, Mr. Graves. Accusations of criminal conduct are irrelevant to the character of any claimant before this court. If there is a witness, I will hear them." The door at the back of the room opened. Every head turned. Virgil Poole walked in. He was not the same man who had ridden away from Clara in the mountain pass. Something had changed in him. The flatness in his eyes had been replaced by something harder, more resolute, the look of a man who has made a decision and intends to see it through regardless of consequence. He wore clean clothes and no weapon. His hands were visible at his sides. Graves's face went the color of ash. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but Graves did not seem to hear. Virgil walked to the front of the room. Judge Beckett swore him in. Virgil placed his hand on the Bible and spoke the oath in a voice that did not waver. State your name and your relationship to the parties in this matter, Beckett had said. Virgil Poole, I've worked for Denton Graves for 6 years. In what capacity? Whatever capacity he required. A murmur rippled through the room. Beckett silenced it with a look. Mr. Poole, do you have information relevant to these proceedings? Virgil looked at Graves, then at Clara, then at the judge. I was present at the mine in southern Illinois when Thomas Whitfield was killed. It was not an accident. Mr. Graves ordered me to weaken the support beams in the lower shaft. The intent was to make the mine unsafe so that Mr. Whitfield would be forced to sell his claim. The beams collapsed sooner than expected. The shaft came down. Thomas Whitfield was at the working face. He was buried under 1,000 tons of rock. Virgil paused. He died because he refused to sell to a man who would not take no for an answer. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of 50 people holding their breath at the same time. Graves's lawyer was on his feet. Your Honor, this witness is clearly motivated by personal animus. His testimony is unreliable and irrelevant to the water rights claim. On the contrary, Beckett said, his voice cutting like a blade, the testimony of Mr. Poole directly addresses the character and methods of the claimant. If Mr. Graves is willing to commit fraud in a land dispute and is credibly accused of involvement in a man's death, this court has every reason to weigh that evidence. He turned to Graves. Mr. Graves, do you wish to respond to these accusations? Graves stood. For a moment, Clara thought he might bluster, deny, threaten. He was a man accustomed to controlling rooms, to bending events to his will through force of personality and the calculated application of pressure. But something had broken. The careful architecture of his confidence had been dismantled piece by piece, first by the survey documents, then by the federal correspondence, then by Virgil's testimony, and what remained was not the smooth, commanding presence of a frontier power broker, but the exposed, cornered posture of a man who had run out of moves. I have nothing to say, Graves said. Beckett nodded. He looked at the documents spread before him. He looked at Clara, at Silas, at Virgil, at Graves. He was quiet for a long time. I have heard sufficient evidence to render judgment on the water rights claim, Beckett said. The certified federal survey documents presented by Mrs. Thornton confirmed that water rights to Clearwater Creek were granted to the Thornton homestead in 1858 and remain attached to that property. The documents further show that Mr. Graves was informed of this fact by the Territorial Land Office 2 years ago and proceeded to file a fraudulent claim regardless. He struck the gavel. The claim of Denton Graves to the water rights of Clearwater Creek is denied. The rights belong to Thornton Ridge and are not subject to further dispute. Another strike. Mr. Graves is hereby fined for filing a fraudulent claim and is prohibited from filing any further land claims within this jurisdiction. A third strike. The testimony of Mr. Poole regarding the death of Thomas Whitfield will be forwarded to the United States Marshal's Office for criminal investigation. Mr. Graves is advised not to leave the territory. Sheriff Ridley stepped forward from his position near the wall. He placed his hand on Graves's arm, not roughly, but with the unmistakable authority of the law. Let's go, Graves. Graves shook off the hand. He straightened his coat. He walked toward the door with the stiff, controlled gait of a man trying to preserve dignity in its final collapse. As he passed Clara, he stopped. Their eyes met. His were filled with a hatred so concentrated it was almost pure, stripped of pretense, stripped of calculation, stripped of everything except the raw fury of a man who has been beaten by someone he considered beneath him. Clara looked back at him. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She stood with her baby in her arms and her husband behind her, and the evidence of Graves' crime spread across the judge's bench, and she said quietly so that only he could hear, "My husband deserved justice, and now he has it." Graves said nothing. Ridley took his arm again, and this time Graves did not resist. He walked out of the town hall and into the cold street, and the door closed behind him with a sound that was not dramatic, but final. Hank Jessup had been standing at the back of the room throughout the hearing, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. As Graves passed him, Hank stepped aside not to make way, but to position himself behind Clara and Silas, a silent declaration of allegiance that required no words. When Clara turned and saw him there, Hank met her eyes and gave a single nod, brief as a heartbeat, but weighted with everything he had never said and everything he now understood. The crowd began to stir. Voices rose. People who had been silent during the hearing now turned to their neighbors with the urgent need to process what they had witnessed. The story of Clara Thornton, the mail-order bride who had saved a ranch and exposed a murderer, was already taking shape, and by nightfall it would reach every homestead in the valley. Silas put his hand on Clara's shoulder. His grip was firm and warm and steady. She leaned into it just slightly and closed her eyes for a moment. It was over. The days that followed the hearing moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a world reassembling itself after upheaval. Silas began rebuilding the barn with help from Hank and 3 neighboring ranchers who arrived without being asked their presence, an unspoken acknowledgement that the valley had misjudged the Thorntons and intended to correct the balance. The new barn rose beam by beam, plank by plank, and Clara watched from the kitchen window as men who had whispered about her 3 months ago now worked alongside her husband without a trace of reservation. Edna Pickett came to Thornton Ridge on a Friday afternoon 6 days after the hearing. Clara saw her from the porch, a solitary figure walking up the road with the cautious gait of someone approaching territory they are not certain they will be welcome in. Clara opened the door and stood in the frame waiting. Edna stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Her face was composed, but something beneath the composure was cracked. And through the cracks, Clara could see the effort it cost this woman to be here. Pride was a hard thing to carry when it had been proven wrong, and Edna Pickett had built her life on the assumption that her pride was warranted. "I was wrong," Edna said. The words came out stiff, reluctant, forced through a throat that clearly wanted to say something else. "I was angry because I missed Eleanor. I punished you for something that was not your fault. I told myself I was protecting Silas, protecting her memory, but that isn't what I was doing. I was being cruel because cruelty was easier than grief." She paused. Her eyes were wet. Her jaw worked. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thornton," she said. "I'm sorry for what I said and what I did, and for the letters I wrote. You deserve better from me, from all of us." Clara looked at her for a long time. She could have spoken. She could have accepted the apology with grace or rejected it with the same cold dignity she had maintained throughout months of gossip and exclusion. Instead, she opened the door wider and said, "Would you like to meet Henry?" Edna's face broke. Not dramatically, not with soft or theatrical emotion, but with the quiet collapse of a wall that has been holding back something too large to contain. She nodded, unable to speak, and followed Claire inside. Henry was on a blanket in the middle of the room, surrounded by his collection of carved wooden toys. He looked up at Edna with the unbiased curiosity of an infant, reached out one fat hand and grabbed her finger. Edna held that tiny hand and cried. Not for Eleanor, not for the baby Eleanor had lost, but for the life in front of her. The warmth of it, the persistence of it, the way it continued despite everything that tried to stop it. She cried because she had spent months trying to deny this child a place in her community, and here he was holding her finger, forgiving her with a grip she did not deserve. Clara brought tea. They sat together at the kitchen table, 2 women who had been enemies for months, and talked about things that had nothing to do with the past. About recipes and weather and the particular difficulty of keeping a kitchen garden alive in Montana soil. They talked like neighbors. And when Edna left an hour later, she paused at the door and said, "Eleanor would have wanted the house to be happy again. I think she would have been glad it's you." Clara watched her walk down the road and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the day she arrived in Elkhorn. Spring came to the valley like a secret being told. First, the ice on Clearwater Creek began to crack thin fractures, spreading across the surface until one morning, the water broke through and ran free, clear and cold, carrying snowmelt from the mountains in a rush that filled the air with sound after months of frozen silence. Then the snow retreated from the fields, pulling back like a blanket being folded, revealing dark soil that steamed in the morning sun. Green appeared in the pastures, tentative at first, then bold, spreading across the hills in a tide that seemed to advance visibly each day. Clara planted a garden beside the kitchen door. Silas rebuilt fences. Henry grew. He could sit up now, and his favorite activity was grabbing whatever was within reach and examining it with the intense concentration of someone trying to understand the fundamental nature of objects. His collection of wooden toys had grown to 8 pieces. The horse, the coo, the star, the wagon, a chicken, a tiny cowboy hat, a small figure of a baby, round and smooth, that Silas had carved with particular care. And the newest addition, a miniature house complete with a porch, windows, and a fence around it. The house was the most detailed piece Silas had ever made. It was Thornton Ridge rendered in walnut, small enough to fit in a baby's hand, but intricate enough to take a man several nights of quiet carving by firelight. Clara had placed the collection on the shelf beside the cradle in a careful row, and she understood that the toys taken together told the story of their family. The horse that brought Clara to the ranch, the cow that she had dragged through the blizzard, the star that Silas looked at from the porch on sleepless nights, the wagon that had carried Clara from Illinois, the chicken that Hank had let loose to test her, the cowboy hat that Silas wore every day, the baby who had changed everything, and the house that held them all. Silas had begun calling Henry my boy. The shift happened without announcement, the way all the important changes in their household happened. One morning, Silas came in from the corral and said, "My boy sleep through the night." And Clara's heart seized in her chest because the possessive was not casual. It was a claim, a quiet, irreversible declaration that this child born to another man carried in a stranger's arms through a frozen valley was his. Clara had begun calling the ranch our home. Our home needs a new water pump. Our home could use a fresh coat of whitewash come summer. Small words, enormous weight. The language of belonging spoken in the everyday grammar of shared life. One evening, Ruth Calloway sat with Clara on the porch while Silas was out checking the far pasture, and Henry slept in his cradle by the open window. The air smelled of new grass and melting snow, and the faint sweetness of wild clover beginning to bloom on the hillside. "Do you love him?" Ruth asked, the way old women ask questions they already know the answer to. Clara was quiet for a long time, watching the light change on the western ridge, the sky turning from blue to gold to the deep burnt orange that Montana produced at the end of every clear day. "I didn't come here for love," Clara said, "but love came anyway, quiet as snow, steady as the creek. I don't know when it started. I only know it's here." Ruth nodded as if Clara had confirmed something Ruth had observed weeks ago. "Good," she said. "That's how the real ones work, the ones that last. They don't arrive with fanfare. They grow from the ground up like everything else worth having on the frontier." The evening that decided everything came on a warm night in late April, the first night of the year when the air held no bite and the windows could be left open without consequence. Henry was asleep. The fire had burned to embers. The house was filled with the sounds of spring coming through the open windows, crickets in creek water, and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. Clara sat on the porch. Silas came out and stood beside her. The sunset was red and gold, and enormous, stretching across the entire western sky, as if the sun were reluctant to leave a day this beautiful. Silas leaned against the porch rail. He was quiet for a time, the kind of quiet that comes before something important. "I thought I needed a wife to survive the winter," he said. "I was wrong." Clara looked at him. The light caught his face, softening the hard angles, warming the gray of his eyes to something closer to silver. "What did you need?" she asked. He turned to her. "I needed you. Not a wife, not a hand for the ranch. You, Clara." He said her name the way he always said it now, with a weight that made it sound like the most important word in the English language. And Clara, who had been holding herself together with discipline and work and the refusal to want more than survival, felt the last of her resistance give way. "And I needed you, Silas. Not a father for my baby. Not a roof over my head. You." Silas stepped closer. He lifted his hand, the one that had been burned, and healed the one that bore new scars alongside the old calluses, and placed it against her face. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, the curve of her chin, the corner of her mouth. His touch was slow and careful, the touch of a man who has learned that the things worth having are the things you must be gentle with. "Then stay," he said. "Not because you have to, because you choose to." "I choose to," Clara said. "I chose you the moment you put your coat over my shoulders in front of that store." He leaned down, she leaned up. And the kiss when it came was not the kiss of a love story. It was not desperate or passionate or cinematic. It was slow and quiet and infinitely tender. The kiss of two people who had walked through a very long winter and come out the other side, not unscathed, not unmarked, but together. It tasted of tea and wood smoke. in the sweet evening air of Montana in spring, and it lasted long enough for the first stars to appear above the ridgeline. 2 weeks later, Silas rode into town alone. He returned in the late afternoon earlier than usual and found Clara in the kitchen with flour on her hands and Henry on the floor, gnawing contentedly on the wooden horse. Silas hung his hat on the peg. He picked up Henry, kissed the top of his head, and set him back down with the ease of a man who has done this 1,000 times. Then he walked to Clara, brushed the flour from her cheek with his thumb, and placed a piece of paper on the table between them. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and unfolded it. The document was short, written in the precise legal language of the territorial court. It stated that Silas Thornton of Thornton Ridge, Elkhorn, Montana Territory, did hereby legally adopt and claim as his own the child Henry Whitfield, henceforth to be known as Henry Whitfield Thornton, with all rights, privileges, and protections accorded to a natural-born son. The document bore the signature of Judge Harlan Beckett and the witness signature of Sheriff Tom Ridley. Clara stared at the paper. The words blurred and reformed and blurred again. She pressed her hand to her mouth. The sound that escaped was not a word, but something older and more elemental, the sound of a woman who has carried a weight for so long that its removal is almost unbearable. She looked at Silas. He stood with his hands at his sides, watching her with those gray eyes that had once been so cold and were now so warm they could have melted the last snow on the highest peak of the valley. "Mine," he said. His voice was thick and rough and certain. "Both of you, not because I needed a wife, because I found my family." Clara crossed the distance between them and put her arms around him and held on. She held on the way you hold something you have been afraid of losing with both hands and all your strength, pressing your face against the solid reality of it. Silas's arms closed around her, and for a long time they stood in the kitchen of their home, with flour dust in the air and the smell of bread baking and their son playing on the floor with a wooden horse carved by the hands of the man who had chosen to be his father. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows lengthened on the floor. Henry looked up from his toys and watched his parents holding each other, and though he was far too young to understand what was happening, he smiled. Evening came to Thornton Ridge the way it always did, with the sky turning gold above the western hills and the long shadows of the fence posts stretching across the grass like the hands of a clock marking the end of another day. The three of them sat on the porch, Silas in his chair, Clara beside him, Henry on her lap, reaching for the last light with both hands as if he could catch it. Below the house, Clearwater Creek glittered in the dusk, running strong and clear over stones that had been there since before any of them were born. In the pastures, cattle grazed on spring grass so green it seemed to glow. The barn, rebuilt in solid, stood against the hillside like a promise kept. Inside the house, the walnut cradle sat beneath the window, the stars carved into its headboard catching the last light. It was no longer a monument to loss. It was a cradle, a place where a child slept. A place built by one father for a daughter who never came, and given by that same man to a son who arrived from 1,000 miles away in the arms of a woman brave enough to walk through a blizzard and bold enough to demand a future. Clara leaned her head against Silas's shoulder. He put his arm around her. Henry made a sound of babble that might have been a word, and Silas smiled. The wind moved through the valley, carrying the scent of new grass and distant rain. Somewhere in the hills, a meadowlark sang. And on the porch of Thornton Ridge, a family sat together in the fading light, not because they had been born to each other, not because fate or blood had joined them, but because they had chosen each other in the hardest season, in the coldest place, with nothing to offer but labor and loyalty and the stubborn, persistent refusal to give up. Clara had come to Montana with a sentence: "I need a father for my baby and you need a wife." It had been a transaction, a negotiation, an appeal to necessity rather than feeling. But necessity, she had learned, was where the strongest things took root. Love did not always arrive in sunlight. Sometimes it came in winter, wrapped in a borrowed coat, carried through a blizzard, and earned one difficult day at a time. The stars appeared. The air cooled. Henry fell asleep against Clara's chest, his breathing deep and even, his small body warm and heavy with the particular weight of an infant who feels completely safe. Silas pressed his lips to Clara's hair and whispered something she did not quite hear. It might have been her name. It might have been stay. It might have been love. It did not matter. She was home.